Testing. All right. We're live.
We are?
We are.
Wait, but we were already live a few minutes ago.
I know. And you did such a good job welcoming people.
And now you just didn't want me to do you tripped the power, so I didn't get to introduce us.
Yeah. The question is whether actually on the different platforms.
Welcome to the Red Couch Theology podcast.
Yeah, we have this cool thing. So if you don't know, if you're a listener that's not a part of South Fellowship Church, which turns out there's a few of you out there.
A few, yeah.
Then welcome. That's kind of cool. But what you may not know about South Fellowship Church is we have this ancient strip mall. And
65,000 square foot strip mall. It's crazy big. And No?
Oh, the audio is there. We're good.
Okay.
So what's fun about this strip mall is several times over the last several years. Actually, I've been here 12 years. And occasionally we have weird electrical things and whatever.
If you get into the ceiling, it kind of like hums and occasionally like static jolts you. It's kind of fun.
Yeah. So like the most recent time we had some weird electrical issues here at the building, I went back and looked at the electrical panel and it was like, there's like tape over things and like handwritten notes and all this stuff. And it was like
1975, don't touch this.
It's super, super confident inducing. And so our awesome facilities team, took a look at that and they're like, yeah, we're going to fix this. Mm-hmm. So the good news is we're getting that fixed. The bad news is we started this podcast already before, but now we have an electrician here who's going through relabeling all of our circuits.
So if we disappear,
like we did last time. We already did this. We were up and running. We're talking. We actually solved world hunger, and you guys missed it. Because...
But if you're listening to this on iTunes, then you won't know any of that, and you didn't even hear the shortened version. But if you're listening on iTunes, you should go on iTunes rating system and give us a rating because that's really helpful.
There you go. We still have more on YouTube, believe it or not, than on iTunes.
YouTube is where it's at.
That's where it's
Even
at. Anyway.
Though, as we learned this Sunday, the guy that founded YouTube wasn't sure it was going to work.
Yeah.
Because human beings are not good at predicting the future, it turns out.
Indeed. So yeah, on this week's episode, we're talking about future anxiety. So hopefully,
well, first maybe just the future in general, because the future is nebulous, right? I mean, it's kind of like its purpose. Its
purpose is to be nebulous.
Maybe.
Really?
Well, maybe there's a reason we're not supposed to overdwell on the future.
Huh.
So like you can't see the future in the same way you can see the past or the present. That was C.S. Lewis's theory anyway. The future is the element of time least like eternity, is what he said.
Okay, wow. All right, you got to unpack that some more. So we're already into the meat of stuff. You're going to throw quotes like that at me?
Because we're kind of futuring and we're not anxiety.
Sure I'm ready. I got to be warmed up.
I'm just trying to give you some anxiety for the future or about the future.
Okay, wait.
C.S. Lewis said that the future was the element of time least like eternity.
Wow, okay.
So
unpack that.
So what he would say is that the present is the only time that eternity touches time, or the only part of time that eternity touches. Like eternity in God's experience is not like this long view back and this long view forward, like this linear thing. It's an ever-present now. So we tend to think of like eternity just as time going on forever. And C.S. Lewis and most philosophers said, no, it's just not time. It's removed from the structures of time.
Now I'm tracking.
So like we tend to think, like, wow, it's just this thing just going and going and going. It's like, no, it's not going anywhere. It's like constantly being. And so the moment you experience now is the moment that's most like eternity. The past is the past. It happened. It's concrete. And so it's knowable. But the future is just this mystery in our human experience that we can't predict, as it turns out, even when we think we can. Although there's all these different things that we do predict. I mean, I gave people on Sunday a load of things that were mispredicted.
Yeah.
Like a bunch of like Steve Jobs saying that the Segway was going to get rid of walking. I mean, like and the people that said no telephones, we'll never use those. So it turns out we're bad at predicting like whether things will work or not. And yet at the same time, there's if you go to The Simpsons, actually, The Simpsons has accurately predicted the future, like multiple times. It predicted Donald Trump being president. And I mean, who really saw that coming? Like it's tapped into some pretty accurate predictions accidentally.
That's funny.
So I guess there's this mystery to it. And so really, yes, how we talked about that on this week was anxiety around the future.
Yeah. So you know what gives me anxiety? Whenever you let go of your cup and it just sits there on this padded surface, it just makes me anxious. And maybe rightfully so, since you already spilled that exact cup on the chair earlier.
If it makes you feel any better, there's hardly anything left in it.
I know, I'm just messing. Yeah, so
what does make you anxious? That's a psychological question, right? That would be.
Oh yeah, like me personally.
Yeah. And do you experience anxiety for the future? I mean, maybe that's too heavy and personal for the lightweight theology podcast that we do.
I feel like I know I do.
Yeah.
But it's like which specific issues are not maybe at the forefront of my mind, which is actually a very interesting thing to recognize. I think awareness is low when it comes to what are my anxieties. Usually I do tend to be more anxious about slightly more current issues. And if they are in the future, they're really near. Like super far out distant anxieties aren't as big of a deal for me, mainly because I can just hide away from them.
Yeah, I don't really think a lot. I'm saying like I don't really think a ton about like I'm saving for my retirement, but I'm not like tracking it. And maybe it's like an age thing. I'm not feeling like it's that close. Yeah. I've got a conversation set up with my retirement guy to talk about, should I have opted out of Social Security? Should I opt out of Social Security? All those different things. But it's not really anxiety. But I do think if I have anxiety about the future, it's this vague awareness that I'm about to enter this phase of life where suddenly the sweet little adorable kids that I have are about to hit years that like pull them in all sorts of directions. And maybe you're a little bit further ahead on the kid. I mean, couple of years ahead, 3 years ahead.
Yeah. And tied at the same time.
Yeah.
Because we have a 10-year gap between
tiny little kids. But I think that like, oh, well, what's going to happen? You know, right now you've got almost full control over your kids. Like you say, no, you can't do this. They can't do it. You can lock down stuff. And then suddenly you move into this phase where you start giving them cars and you start giving them internet access and you start giving them all these different things. And you're like, oh, yeah, I don't know. I don't actually know that that's as concrete as it's felt for a long time. And so I think that's not like something that I would feel like, you know, we've talked about symptoms of anxiety. It's not that I have obvious symptoms about it. It's more like I wonder. I don't know.
Yeah. So you hunker down specifically in a single in one main passage in the Sermon on the Mount. And so talk about that a little bit, because and how that text sort of aligned with this idea of future or anxiety that starts with challenges related to the future.
So it's delightfully mysterious, because for those of you that aren't super familiar with a framework for understanding biblical writers, which maybe some of us were working with a book, Matthew, written in Greek, probably with a bunch of sayings that were said in Aramaic that he's put into book form in a different language, and now we're reading it in English in all sorts of translations. You may have the NIV, the ESV, all these different acronyms we throw out. Some of them are great. Some of them are okay. Some of them are trying to be different so they can sell another version of the Bible. It's, I mean, there's all those different elements that go into reading a text that's 2,000 years old.
Yeah.
And so reading the English words, what we read is Jesus talking about worry on the surface. So I can't actually read it on Aaron's tiny little screen.
Oh.
You can probably read it.
Here you go.
6:25.
Yeah.
And why do you worry about clothes? Oh no, I need to read higher than that. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food? Is not the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? The actual literal Greek there is an inch to your height, which I feel regularly because I stand next to Aaron on stage and people come up to me afterwards and say, you're a lot taller than you look on stage. And I'm like, because I'm standing next to someone who's 6'4".
Yeah.
I'm a perfectly reasonable 6'1.5 inches.
So interesting about this passage is similar to the Philippians text. There's sort of this feeling like, just don't worry. And you're kind of like, how?
Anxiety inducing.
Yeah, it's anxiety inducing, and
especially if not worrying then becomes a spiritual test that you pass or fail.
Yes. So it on one reading of this, like if you just looked at that passage, if you want to look it up yourself again, it's Matthew 6, starting in 25. You could say, okay, here's the formula. The formula is, don't worry, because God takes care of the birds and the flowers of the field, and as long as you don't worry, He's going to take care of you too, and everything's going to be dandy. And then you're kind of like step back, and if you're critical, if you have a critical eye or thought process at all, suddenly you're like, is he even?
Yeah,
is he even right?
Even like, so I tend to split like different. Like there's three broad readings that I think we operate in church circles, and I try and land in the middle one, which of course I therefore think is the healthy one. So there's like an overly literal reading, which is just, I don't need any framework for understanding scripture. I can read it as a 21st century person as though it wasn't written 2,000 years ago, which I don't think is healthy. Then there's the supreme critical reading, which is, I'm going to come with my own framework that's so rigid. If this doesn't seem like something a rabbi would say in the first century, I'm going to assume Jesus didn't really say it, and it's been changed or redacted or all those different things. And I'm like, even just if you accept Jesus is vaguely who he says he is, he's clearly not just a normal rabbi, and therefore can say some things that no other rabbi has said. So there's these two like different extremes. And then the middle one is what I would call believing criticism, which is approaching the text to want to learn like the depths of it. Why is the language this way? What does this mean? Like, is Jesus being, is he using hyperbole? Is he doing something intentional, like reflecting back on a past story, all those different elements, while generally holding this belief that God is working in the world through his son, Jesus, for its redemption and salvation. So it's like hopefully the middle ground of those two different things. So you come to this text, and my first question is, has Jesus not seen anyone starve? Because it feels like in the first century,
even any birds
Judah,
starve.
Yeah.
Like,
and given his people's story, I mean, there's multiple times that the story of his people has been, we're in a city, we're under siege, people are starving to death. So you kind of read it and you're like, like, what do you mean God feeds the birds and therefore he'll feed you?
So this is maybe just a side note to affirm, because I would share a similar perspective to how we should engage a text that you just described. But like, in my experience, one of the exciting things about a passage is when it rubs me wrong, or when I don't even think it could possibly be true, because I feel like those are almost like little hints that this one's really important. If
Yeah.
it chafes against me a little
Yeah,
bit,
yeah, yeah.
or I don't understand, or it's confusing, or it seems like I disagree even, usually that's a sign that I should hang out there
Yeah.
and keep praying and keep studying and keep exploring until I find the nugget. And usually those nuggets, when I do get to them, tend to be more fruitful, more life-giving, and more helpful in my life than some of the things that seem like really easy and self-evident. And you're like, yeah, totally, I agree, and it's good to go.
And then the other tension with this passage is what does he mean by the word worry, which in Greek is rooted in a word marimneo, which worry, distracted. It's got all of these different elements swirling around, and so then the question becomes like, take the word worry, Jesus, what do you mean? Are you talking about worrying about having enough, or worrying about getting plenty? And those are completely different things.
Yes, totally. Well, so let's maybe look at this passage again and factor in that merimneo.
Yeah.
Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Word. So here's the passage again. So therefore, I tell you, do not be distracted about your life or divided, sort of like
Yeah.
your mind is in too many places.
Don't let that be the focus.
So don't be overly focused on the about your life, when you will eat, when you will drink, your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and your body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air, and so on and so forth. So
then the language becomes like,
how are you suggesting that changes this feel?
well, so then it becomes like, look at the birds of the air. They're not striving for extra, yet they've got plenty. Look at the flowers of the fields. They're not striving to get the best clothes, and yet does even Solomon wear clothes as good as they? Then all the language points in this direction of like, of desire for the best. And so there's definitely, with the two elements, Jesus picks food and clothing. They tread this line between necessity and luxury. And I felt that it's weird. Like this week in studying this passage, I have a house that lots of people would love. My house. It's a lovely house. God provided it for us in this wonderful way. It was sold to us by an elder here who was moving on just as we were arriving, and it was real, like this moment of provision. It's in our price range. We can afford it. It's gone up in value. There's all these different elements to it. We sit on the deck. You can see the mountains, everything we hope for in a house in Colorado. And then we do small group with a couple that just moved out to Sedalia. And so we went over to see their house. And I said semi-jokingly to them, I've been in wonderful houses since I moved here. This is the most envious I've felt of a house. Like, it's 10 acres. It's got these old wood floors. It feels like a home that's been lived in for centuries. Like, it's got some Englishness to it as well, which is probably what attracted me to it.
Yeah.
And so, like, I'm home the next day, like, Googling houses in Sedalia, looking for ones with warm old wood floors, when I'm supposed to be writing a sermon. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like, I'm lost in the merimneo of distraction in this moment.
Yes.
Trying to get myself something that I don't need.
That was actually a little bit of an aha moment for me as you were preaching, because you very gently pointed out and maybe encouraged people to ask themselves, are the things I'm anxious about in the future stemming from like doom, gloom issues?
Yes.
Or dangers, or are they that I'm not going to get the things that I really hoped I was going to get possession-wise or experience or life comfort-wise? And I was like, ooh, that feels close to home.
And the bizarre thing for me, knowing lots of people in our community, both services, when I got to the point of talking about, I actually used the phrase like, in terms of like necessity and luxury, like there's having a house and then there's having a second house. And I actually, there were people sat on the front or second row in both services, both of whom I know have just both bought or are building a second home. And I was like, do I hold back from that? Because in actual fact, the thing is, I don't think they're doing anything wrong.
Totally.
Like I'm like, in actual fact, knowing both of their stories, like God has provided in a particular way, and knowing those people, they'll use those homes for wonderful things and hospitality and all those different elements. What Jesus is talking about is the obsession of it.
And the anxiety of not being able to, and
Yes,
or
exactly.
or I actually don't know if this is true because I've never been like obnoxiously wealthy, but I've heard that it's very anxiety inducing because you just have so many variables out there that you own of assets and real estate and stuff that sometimes it's almost anxiety inducing because it's just so many things to try and factor in.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I used, I think in the sermon, this acquaintance of mine who said like, no recession can make it so I have to work again. Now it felt to me at the time a little bit like, whoa, it's like building barns and, but at the same time, it could easily have been true. Like for the most part, 99% true.
Yeah.
And even he said like, I am still an anxious person, not anxious for me personally. That was where he was really going with it.
Yeah.
But it was, I have 600 employees. And every time the economy starts to tank, I'm like, wow, who loses their job? Because I don't have enough money to be able to just pay them for nothing. So like there is always another level of anxiety that can land on you depending on wealth.
And you might have someone who say, well, yeah, you do have enough money as long as you sacrifice some yourself.
Yeah.
And you're like, but that's not how someone gets to the position that they're in.
Totally. And,
like someone who's frugal doesn't get to the end and becomes wealthy over time, doesn't get there by making horrible financial decisions.
And
so
most of them are aware that they could give away everything that they have. And give this huge one-time gift, but in actual fact, by having wealth that accumulates, they can give away more over a lifetime than they ever could by just getting rid of it all.
Yeah, it's like, so it's not that simple. It's not that having possessions is evil or any of those things. What this text is hinting at is this division of heart and this like anxiety that surrounds those possessions, and like almost like closed fist around either the possession itself or the dream of having it or not having it.
And this is where Jesus' teaching gets really hard for us that have chosen to follow him, I think, because the context for all of this is in this Sermon on the Mount that you reference. It's 2,000 words long, takes about 12 minutes to deliver, which is way shorter than most of my sermons. I read it, I'm like, this is what being concise looks like. Not something that's in my wheelhouse.
Mine either. Every time I've preached, it's super hard. I make fun of preachers all the time, and then when I preach, I'm like, well,
56 minutes later. So Jesus' context for this, or the context Matthew actually places this in the biographer, is Jesus. The crowds follow Jesus up a mountain, and his disciples gather around him, and he teaches them. Like the crowd's going to listen, and some of them will opt in to discipleship based on listening. They'll pick up practical wisdom that Jesus has a good way to live. But for the people that have chosen and been chosen, discipleship, for them, these are commands. This is his yoke, his way of living. He's like, if you want to follow me, this is what it looks like. That's the Sermon on the Mount purpose.
It's his thesis statement about what should be.
Yeah. And so you don't really, as a follower, get to say yes or no to different elements of it. You're either in on the whole or you're not in. I mean, that's the implication behind someone giving their thesis of life. A rabbi giving what was called a yoke, like a thing that you wore. So for us, this is like, no, this is what it looks like to follow me. And his whole point is you're called to the kingdom. This big story, don't get distracted by non-kingdom stuff. And that is so different than the call to follow Jesus in the 21st century, which is say a prayer, like make sure you go to the right place when you die, but just keep living like everybody else for the most part. So Jesus says in this really challenging way, my followers don't worry about having enough, and they don't worry about getting more. Like that's the broad stroke statement of it.
Yes.
Like, if you're following me and you're part of my kingdom, you will be taken care of. And we're like, ooh, really? And you don't need to stress about getting more and more stuff. And we're like, ooh, really?
Yeah. Okay. So then, what about the stories I've heard of, like, missionaries who are starving and or martyred,
Yeah,
or whatever, and they're focused on the kingdom,
totally.
and yet they're poor and hungry and abused, and so, yeah, what's up with that?
Wait, hold on a second. When I raised that issue the first time when we first talked about this, you're the one that talked about the missionaries that were fed, and I was the one that questioned whether Jesus is right. I think you should answer that question on me. Because you were like, oh yeah, everyone gets provided for. No, that's not really what you said.
No, it isn't, but I think it's worth bringing up again, because it is a tension in all of these passages, right?
So I think what we reflected on in our personal experience, which again, hard part of following Jesus, I have my personal experience. It doesn't override what Jesus says.
Totally.
So, but my like testiness with it, my struggle with it is, I have seen this both work and not work from my perspective.
Depending on how you define work.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know ways, like I worked with an organization out in Romania that fed 200 people a day, all of them elderly, homeless, many of them disabled or mentally ill. And the guy that I've talked about, the guy that ran it before, but Varel would say sometimes, we just didn't have anything, and a huge pile of meat would just turn up on the doorstep.
Yeah.
Don't know where it came from, didn't have enough to pay for it, and it just turned up as a gift. And I've heard those stories in more places than I can count. Missionaries that needed to raise funds for a certain amount, and the exact amount appears on a check that day in the post. So
the answer is that yes, God does seem to show up in some unique and supernatural ways for those who are on task and on mission. That does seem to be a pattern that's evidence that is evident in the world. But there's also some outliers where you're like, well, what's going on with that? Were they just not faithful enough? Did they not avoid worry hard enough? And that was that tension. But then you actually shifted and made this argument. I mean, I've got your big idea here that I thought the way you took it was, I've got to open the right app. This is where you sort of landed. We think future peace depends on prosperity, but it actually depends on presence. And I think what your argument is there may be this pattern where God provides for those who are really on task and on mission and advancing his kingdom. But there's also outliers, but there's one thing that's never an outlier. He is present in and through it all.
Yeah, and I think
that's a promise that we can take to the bank and it'll cash every time.
And I think that's where it gets fascinating, right? With reading scripture, and it's these different writers that come together to form a cohesive narrative that we believe God has breathed on and inspired in a particular way. So it's different than any other book. You get to have scripture interpret scripture. It's fascinating. You get to read it in the different light. Like Paul specifically says, can anything separate us from the love of God? Can nakedness? Well, how can there be nakedness if Jesus' text here is simply, there'll always be clothing?
Yeah.
Can starvation, can hunger? Well, how can there be hunger if this text is simply, oh no, there's always food? Like it specifically says there are times where we go through that situation.
Which would be one argument against the whole super duper literalist style of interpretation, right? Anyway, let's just set that aside.
Yeah.
That's beside the point.
In actual fact, like Jesus' bigger argument here seems to be not about whether the circumstances are always good, but what we actually achieve with our worry. Like what we actually achieve with our distraction. His teaching point seems to be you get off mission when that's your obsession.
Yes.
You don't end up operating well within the rhythms of my big story when you're obsessed with this world story. And so his encouragement to his followers is, you don't need to let this stuff get to you. It's different for you than everybody else. Of course, people outside of the story are going to obsess over it.
Yeah.
But you don't need to obsess over it. Like there's a bigger, and again, when you couple that with his teaching on what this life means and this world means and how tied or attached you should be to it, well, it all seems to make sense. Like, even if he doesn't provide, is that the worst thing? I mean, we've talked about that in terms of anxiety. Like, both of our practices is to go through the progressions of, well, how bad can the story be?
Yeah.
And you get to like, well, even if this, and that's what Paul does.
Yeah, totally. And so your conclusion at the end of the message was this big idea that this, like, we have this maybe false perception that, like, if we get the formula right, if we don't worry and we have enough faith and we play the game right, the end game will be prosperity.
Yes.
Some sort of earthly, financial, monetary, clothing outcome. And the answer is sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes not. There's too many examples throughout history that that's not been the case. But what you're suggesting is that presence is the guarantee through any situation. And you did that red card, green card illustration. It was actually a pink card.
It was annoyingly a pink card. Red card, green card, pink card.
So yeah, unpack that for people. What was going on with that?
So yeah, the first way of reading that, when we looked at the text and we talked about, was it worry in terms of not having enough in terms of necessity, or is it distraction in terms of luxury? Well, like, if we read it the first way, we're constantly worried about the things on the red card, which in Jesus' illustration, in Jesus' illustration, it's just not having enough food and not having enough clothes. It's very first century.
Yep.
We've probably added, just by our way of living, a whole bunch of other stuff to that subject. Like, we worry about everything because we're always feeling this need. It's now no longer food and clothing. It's finding the right school for our kids. It's finding, like, the right house to live in. It's like there's a bunch of stuff that could go on that red card. And so if we read it the first way, like, we are inclined, wired to worry about the red card. And Jesus' implication is like, no, you don't need to worry about the red card. And then if we read it the second way, in terms of distraction, we have a whole bunch of stuff on the green card. And that can be anything from, I want this new outfit that I saw in the store all the way through. I want a second home all the way through. I want to be able to, I don't know, fly to Hawaii twice a year and do a beach vacation. Like, and then, like, the theory is we just chase the green card. And either way, Jesus pulls us back into, no, you don't worry, you don't chase. And it's a recognition that sometimes the worry about the red card, the chasing of the green card, is really, on one hand, a worry that God won't provide and we won't have enough, or potentially with the other one, and this is the one that I find really, like, grabs at me a little bit, is I want to get to a place where I don't need to rely on God for anything. Like, that's the undercurrent of it. Like, you know, I'm self-sufficient now. And why is that so dangerous? Well, the implication of it is we think our accumulated stuff is more reliable than our Father. Like,
yes.
Like that's the story of that Jesus pulls in of the guy with the barns.
Yep.
I had barns. I had more stuff, so I built bigger barns to put them in. And now,
and if I have enough of them and they're all situated and full, then maybe I can
no
kick
recession
back and
can
relax.
touch me. Like, it's like, it's that's the, how can you ever operate as someone in the kingdom when that's the mentality?
Yep.
And the danger for us, I think, as 21st century followers, is that we give just enough to that kingdom, that we feel like we've done just enough. And the dangerous ask is that the dangerous reading of Jesus is that he really says, everything you have is mine. It's just, you're just a steward.
Yep.
And I can't remember if we talked about this the other week, but it's so worth telling again, because it's it's such a great illustration to me. Like when you think of yourself as a steward over your stuff, like you're kind of like a house sitter in our modern day language. And what's the two dangers of a house sitter? Like on one hand, like if I ask someone to look after my house while I'm gone, the one danger is that they just say, you know what? I'm not really fussed about any of this stuff. I'm going to spill stuff. I'm not going to clear it up. I'm going to leave the doors open. And when Alex comes back, his house is going to be trashed and I won't even be here. That's like our natural fear. The other danger is that I get back and they've changed the lock on the door. And they're sitting in the living room that used to be mine with their Xbox on the TV. And they refuse to let me in because they've taken ownership. And those are both like the potential like pitfalls of stewardship. Like that stewardship lands in the middle.
Yeah.
But stewardship moves to ownership really easily. And in actual fact, like for the Tolkien nerds out there, which I'm sure there's two, that's the question that comes up in Tolkien's language. The steward says to his son, like, "No,
totally,
yeah."
So, all right, one final question. All right, it seems like, and if you hadn't been catching on to this, we've actually hinted at it a couple different times in the podcast that each week presence has been sort of this biblical remedy or spiritual remedy of anxiety in one way, shape, or form. And first of all, we get, and we've said this on each episode, we get that just saying that is one thing. Experiencing is a whole other challenge. And sometimes getting to a place of health when it deals with anxiety does require some professional help and those sorts of things. So we don't want to negate that and just say, this is the solution. Just remember that God's with you. But that leads me to my question. Maybe there's someone out there and they're like, yeah, okay, presence. It's not that big of a promise for me. I don't really enjoy God's presence, or I haven't experienced it in a long time, or like that doesn't even sound like that big of a promise to me. How is that supposed to deal with my anxiety?
And there's obviously like there's two really obvious ways you could take that. C.S. Lewis, who I quoted earlier. I mean, evangelical, so it's like quoting the Pope for a Catholic. It's like, but
nice.
So he talks about there is clearly a difference between the idea that God is present and that as an experience. So it's like
okay,
like there's a theological truth to presence. We talked about it when we did communion.
We're like, yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, he's here.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked about that like with communion, like God is present in a particular way.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily like an awareness we have in any of our senses. And then lurking around are these stories of like, oh no, I've had moments where God was present and it changed everything. It was concretely different.
Yes.
So okay. That like it's possible. Just possible, and again, all philosophy is maybes and perhapses. It's just possible that if you were to approach the idea of God's presence and say, yeah, it's not that big of a deal, it might be because you haven't experienced it in that particular way, and that might be a possibility. And you might find that if you did experience it, it would change everything about how you thought about God's presence and all of your situation that you live in. That's just a possibility that.
Yeah, totally.
We would. So that's the first one.
Yeah. Okay.
The second element theologically to presence is how Jesus saw the church, because it was a different type of community.
Yeah.
And so when it talks about presence, in actual fact, that's one of the theological readings of this text. Like the writer Clarence Jordan would say, well, how do the birds get their food? Well, they get it because the system provides it. The flowers get it because the system, ecology, provides it. How do the followers of Jesus get their food? Well, the system that they've chosen to live in provides it. Like, so he would say it's abhorrent that any follower of Jesus in a community should be lonely, hungry, naked, like any of those elements, because the community should when it's working right, provide. And that's like what you see in the first church community, the Acts community. Did anyone not have enough? No. Was it because they all were getting packages of meat on their doorstep, or they all had good jobs? No. The community came together and said, no, we are present with each other, and God is present with us in that. So that's like, that's the second element. It's not just
it's like, how is God present?
Yeah.
He's present in and through his people.
Yes.
For each other. Like, one of the challenges of being a follower of Jesus is that, and actually this is true maybe of a bunch of different things related to faith, but it's like he's not physically here to talk to and ask a question and then get the hug, like that sort of thing. And he's like, oh yeah, I am.
Yeah.
I left my church for that purpose.
And I had this really interesting conversation with a friend who she was just questioning theologically whether the church she was in was the right place, like whether it had enough vision, whether it had enough like of the same tendencies and stuff. And then they had this family tragedy, or near tragedy, family moment of crisis.
Yeah.
And the church just like came around them and poured out love for them.
Yeah.
And so my question in the midst of that was, so what does that mean? And then there's this moment of like, oh no, these are my people. It's funny how like all the things we think are really important, like, is the church like theologically, do I agree with everything? Is the church on mission enough? Is the church this? Is the church that?
Do they do the style of music that I like? Do they?
Yeah. Is it
clean?
too loud? Is it too quiet?
tidy?
All those different elements. Does it meet in a building with a steeple? Does it meet in a strip mall? Fade away in moments of crisis, and the only question you're left with are these my people?
Yeah.
Which was fascinating to me, really. Like you can get very, I might look for a different community, and then you realize, well, if you've actually got people that are your people, then that's a wonderful place to be in.
Totally. Well, was there anything else that you thought, like, okay, here we are, middle of the week, you preached this message several days ago, and maybe something resonated, but you're like, I really hope that halfway through the week, our community doesn't forget fill in the blank?
So I think, if anything, it is just this awareness of how, and we'll get to this in a few weeks when we talk about listening to the voice of God.
Yeah.
Just how difficult this is to do. Any of the Sermon on the Mount stuff is to do, really, without this constant engagement with who God is. And even that process of learning the conversational relationship. Because this is all natural, isn't it? Like, it is natural to worry, will you have enough? Like, you start looking at retirement, you start looking at
inflation, deflation.
Yeah, trying to buy a house, trying to provide for your kids. Like Laura and I send our kids to this school that we love, but it does cost a little bit to send them there. It's not a public school, and that was like a conscious choice.
Yep.
And so we made that choice, and then Jude would go next year, and so we kind of looked at each other and said, well, do we want Jude to go? And we were like, well, we don't want him to go to public school 5 days a week. We like this rhythm as a family. But it's going to cost this much extra. And the natural tendency is to be like, oh my goodness, where's that going to come from? And I kind of looked at Laura and said, well, we can't really afford the two we're paying for at the moment. Like, does a third one actually make any difference?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure it does, in terms of we're still looking for provision.
Totally.
But we're asking the question, God, like, is this what you have for them?
Yeah.
So it is hard to do it's impossible to do outside the idea of relationship, and that's what Jesus really drives home.
Yeah, and so maybe this ties the whole conversation into a nice bow. We talked about initially even some more like biblical interpretation ideas around this text seems difficult and confusing and challenging and stuff, and you gave them the option they could either throw it out and say it wasn't in there and Jesus probably didn't say that's like this extreme that we don't want to go to. You can say, no, it means it. Just have more faith and just don't worry. And that's not the route we want to go. But what you're suggesting, even with the conclusion of this conversation, is, yeah, this is hard. And that's sit in that.
Yeah, and
linger there. This is going to be a challenging thing. It's not like the truth of the scriptures and the way of Jesus is like this thing where like, ding, light bulb, cool, easy, next step, cakewalk.
Yeah, it's super hard. And some of this comes down to something that we'll talk about a little bit this week. Jesus says, are you not much more valuable than they? Your father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Actually believing that your father thinks that you're more valuable than they is harder than it sounds sometimes.
Totally.
Like when we think about present anxiety, one of the conversations will be, how does God see us? Because that theoretically is the thing that matters most. But just like think about influence, like when you see your kids go off to school 8 hours a day, you suddenly realize they'll spend more time with their friends than they'll spend with you. It's possible that's also correlated with they'll start to worry more about what their friends think about them than what you think about them.
Yep.
Same is true with this father that we're talking about. Like in the end, does it matter what he thinks about us? Because it should.
Yeah.
But maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, and totally.
So
that's the tension. But that's next week.
That's next week.
We'll talk about that soon. Anything else you want to cover?
No. This was a lovely conversation.
That's great.
Have a great week, guys.
Yeah,
we'll
have a great
see
week.
you next week.
We did not get questions. I know we've talked about this last few weeks. We didn't get any questions this week where we had this question for ourselves. Maybe we don't need to invite questions.
Maybe we're so good at putting bows on arguments, bringing everything round to conclusion.
We're just that clear and that... We laugh because it just doesn't feel that way at all. But it does mean that maybe some of the content is just something that people want to process and they don't have a question ready yet. But we'll see. We're going to still offer that text in your question things on the weekends, and we'll see how it goes over the next few weeks. If we don't get any questions over the next few weeks, maybe that just won't be part of the show. And
maybe we'll just leave the number up forever, and then like 6 months in, suddenly someone will ask a question and we're like, wow.
What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow, right? That's the question we'll get.
Yeah. What is the unladen
An African swallow or a European swallow? That's the correct answer.
Which kind of bear is best? Black bear.
Black bear. Definitely. Wow, we had a Monty Python quote and an Office quote. That's a great way to wrap the show. We love y'all, and we'll see you.
Like, subscribe,
next
share YouTube videos.
Indeed. All the things, because it's helpful.